Paul said, "For I would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life." Mrs. Pratt and I have been missionaries in the Far East for 35 years. In 1938, we went out for a second term in the Philippines. War clouds were already gathering in the Far East. In fact, we had come home in 1937 on a Japanese silk boat which carried $15 million worth of gold for the States, which was used, we are told, to buy scrap iron, later used in bombs, and bombed our own boys. We didn't know that at the time. In 1938, we returned to the Philippines and were assigned to a city in the south called Iloilo. There we labored from 38, 39, 40, and 41. The Lord blessed our work very much, and it was the largest mission in the Philippines in our work. We saw what was coming, but we were not afraid. Maybe we didn't know enough to be afraid. I do not know. I'm not saying why we were not afraid. There were more than 6,000 members of our church in that section, and they were looking to us for leadership. And so we didn't dare to be afraid. And if we were, we wouldn't dare to show it. In December, you remember the war broke. I think it broke on December 17th, but it broke over there on December 18th, because there is a difference of a day. Just to illustrate, one of our missionary families had a child born in their home, and they sent a cable. Can you hear? They sent a cable home announcing the birth of the child, and the cable arrived the day before the child was born. That's the difference in the time. Actually, it was not so. But the date was such that they got the news a day before the child was born. There is a date line out there in the Pacific, which we have crossed many times. Going one way, you repeat a day, and going another way, you drop a day. And one day we came across that line on our 20th wedding anniversary, and because they repeated the day, we had 2 wedding anniversaries the same year, which is good enough for Ripley, is it not? Well, in December the war broke, and I shall never forget how 10 days later they bombed our city. It is one thing to be standing here tonight and talking about it, and quite another thing to be in a city that's being bombed. You folks, unless you have been in the war, have no idea what it means to be in a city when the planes are going overhead, scores and scores of them, and as we called it, laying their eggs. They destroyed our airport, our airplanes, and destroyed the oil installation. They even bombed a sugar warehouse, and it burned, and then molasses was made by the burning, the melting. 350,000 sacks of sugar were burned, and molasses ran through the streets of that city. Not like water, because it flows rather slowly. Terrible destruction. They came down low and machine gunned the people. Our hospitals were full of wounded and dead. Streets where people were on the streets. That was war, and we realized it at that time. Another thing that made us realize there was a war, we lived, of course, down south, a couple of 100 miles south of Manila. But still they came that way. A ship called the Corregidor, which is named for that island fortress in Manila Bay, left Manila with more than 1,400 people on board, ordinarily never carried more than 500. She was challenged at the fortress of Corregidor, same name, stopped and made herself known to them, then started on, and somehow in the waiting and the stopping, she drifted onto an American mine and sunk with 1,400 people. 287 only were saved. This, of course, made us know we're at war. This was the greatest catastrophe up to that time in the war. I evacuated with my family to a little island called Gimras, where we had an academy, a 12th-grade school, which I was the chairman of the board, and there, because of the frequent bombings in Iloilo, we felt a little safer. We'd go up in the hills, mountains of that little place, and look over and see them bombing the city of Iloilo. We were about 7 miles away. We had a ringside seat. The Japanese did not bother us for a time. In fact, they did not come down there at first. They took Manila, and they took the surrounding territory, and Corregidor fell, and the Battle of Bataan, which you call Bataan, which is not right, Bataan, and those things were going on. Then one day I went to my office. I went every day to my office, 7 miles by native Parao. One day a man by the name of Jimmy Lees, a Britisher, who was the acting vice consul in that city, a man with whom I had fellowshipped and knew well, he said, "Mr. Pratt, I would not come any more to Iloilo. The Japanese are almost here." He had ways of communication that I didn't know about. He said, "They'll be here any day, any minute, and I don't think I would come any more." I didn't come the next day, and that next day Jimmy Lees was killed by the Japanese. They came into the consulate and found him destroying the papers, which is quite the thing to do in such a case, and before nightfall he was a dead man. Also the president or the manager of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, a British bank. They were thrown into a well, and later on their bodies were discovered, and a friend of mine, when they discovered them, thought it was me, because we were the same size and looked about the same. Sorry for that man, but that's what they said. This was war. So we stayed on the island of Gimras for a few weeks, held services with our members there at the academy, and I shall well remember the night that I slept the last night in my own home. I should say before I go further, however, that what I say tonight, some of the things are going to be quite terrible, that I harbor no ill will or hatred towards the Japanese people. We have suffered, the Filipino people suffered much from the Japanese, and I wondered how I might feel if I ever met them. But after the war, I went back and went to Japan many, many times, and I'm glad to tell you that I have never felt any hatred towards them. I want to say this before I go on any more. That night, I remember we listened to the radio. It told us about the fall of Corregidor, and that was the last time I heard the radio, I suppose, for about 3 years. We went to bed as usual. We had 2 dogs. The Lees, with whom we were staying, and we had a dog. They had one. They barked early in the morning. My wife looked out the window and she said, "The Japanese are surrounding our house." I quickly got up and looked out, and sure enough, Japanese were running to the 4 corners of our house with fixed bayonets, and before I could get dressed, they were inside the house, although the doors were locked, and demanding that we get up. Of course, it didn't take us long to get dressed. They stayed in our house for a short time. We gave them a hot drink. But they said that Mr. Lee and myself must go to the city of Iloilo and there register, but that we need not to worry. We would be back again that night. Never was a slicker lie told in the world, for we never got back. We never saw that house again, for it was destroyed. So they were in such a hurry that we didn't eat any breakfast, and I've always regretted that. I don't mind missing a breakfast once in a while or a meal. That isn't so bad, but that was a good breakfast that I missed. But they were urging us to hurry and to go, and so we made a hot drink, and we had some of that, and gave them some. We did not forget, however, to pray. And I would like to emphasize, my dear people, how important it is to pray to God the Father. We had worship in the kitchen, around the kitchen stove. We knelt down thinking that we would have worship again with our families that evening, but we didn't. And I remember we prayed that God would protect our wives and our children and us as we separated, apparently for just a few hours. We kissed our wives goodbye, and I've always been thankful for that kiss. You know, you married folks, I do not know whether you ever kiss your wives or not, or do it often or frequently, or do it. But do you know, I'm glad I kissed my wife goodbye, for it was a long time before I saw her again. You know how attentive we were when we were first married, or before we were married? My, there was nothing too good for our wives. We brought them flowers and candy, and we said so many nice things. And then after we get married, if we are not careful, we're apt to forget those little attentions. Well, I'm glad I kissed my wife goodbye. I thought I could see her again that evening. We were marched down the road. We were on a hill, guarded on all sides by Japanese. This was Brother Lee and myself. He was the principal of our academy. Taken over to the city of Iloilo, and before nightfall, we found ourselves in the Iloilo jail with about 40 other Americans, some British, and I'll tell you who were at war with the Japanese. They didn't keep their promise. They had no intention of keeping that. In my pocket, a handkerchief. I didn't even have a comb. I had about $3 in money, and this very book, which is the New Testament. This is it, and this is the cover I had on it. Now that's sacred to me. I had no razor, no comb, no soap, no towel. And I had to go along like that for many months. You know, we think we have to have so many things to live. But we didn't have that. The people in the prison camp, many of them were Baptist missionaries. I bless their memory. Some of the most wonderful friends we have tonight are those Baptist missionaries. They shared their food that they had, and things were not too bad for about 3 weeks. They took us out in squads of 10 to prepare another place for the prison camp, for this was very crowded. They allowed us to go in and out of the cells in the jail up until 8 o'clock at night, and we could talk and visit, and we shared our food and shared our problems. And then on a Saturday morning, I shall never forget it, the announcement was made, we're going to transfer you to the prison camp which we had been preparing. I had worked on the fence. The fence was made about 8 feet high, and later on was extended to 16 feet high, so we couldn't look over the top. But I'm getting ahead of my story. And then just before we left, they said that a doctor, what's his name? Dr. Cullen, American doctor, a Walter Saul, a Britisher, and Mr. James Lee, our missionary, and the speaker of the evening should remain behind. And all the others were taken away. I cannot tell you the feelings that I had. It was awful. So they went away. They went to a better place. And we went, as I will show you in a moment, to a worse place. For as soon as they had left, they took this Dr. Cullen and me, marched us to a cell number 8, shoved us in like you would cattle, and then the barred door was shut and a padlock on the outside. They took this Mr. James Lee and Walter Saul in another cell along the same side. The jail, by the way, was arranged around a patio. They could go into the cells from the patio. I might tell you a little bit about, first maybe about maybe about the cell. This cell was a filthy place. You would not keep chickens in such a place. The Baptist missionary doctor, who, by the way, is one of my closest friends, so close that we call each other by our first name. He said, Mr. Pratt, Forrest, he called him a name, he says, don't go in cell number 8. We have a man in this camp who has one of those unspeakable diseases, and we are isolating him there. So we didn't go in. Without any cleansing of that cell, they put us in there, and it was filthy. The facilities had much to be desired. They had all the modern inconveniences, and I mean that literally. The beds were of plank, thick plank, without anything on them. The doctor had been tied up by his thumbs and feet for some time previously, and when he came into that cell with me, he was in terrible condition. I massaged his thumbs and his ankles and took care of him for several months, and he testified many, many times that I saved his life. Be that as it may, I saved my own also. As we help others, we help ourselves. We do not do it for that purpose, but that is actually what happens. For 9 days, they never opened the cell door. They brought our food, which consisted of 4 or 5 small fish and a cup and a half of rice, put the 2 plates together and shoved it through the bars. And the doctor, when he looked at these 4 fish, he said, my cat would turn up his nose at this fish. It was filthy. The sun came into that cell 4 or 5 or 6 inches a day only. And we would stand up to those bars and just try to drink in a little sun. They gave us 2 quarts of water for 2 men each day. This was for bathing and for drinking purposes, and it was full of all sorts of wigglers and whatnot. I had a dirty handkerchief. We couldn't wash it. I strained this water through this dirty handkerchief, and we drank that filthy water and took a bath in a cup of water about. It's surprising what you can do with a cup of water if you have to. Those were the conditions under which we lived and existed, and it wasn't very pleasant. And I don't like to think about it even now. I must go back and say something about kissing your wife. I told that story in one of the eastern states, and the man went home from the meeting and kissed his wife, and she told me afterwards, we had dinner with them, she said she almost fainted. Some of you men might try that tonight. When you go home, Be sure your wife is somewhere near a chair, but try it. It might surprise her. And you women folks too, you might surprise your wives, you know. Sometimes it's not a one-way traffic. It works both ways. I just want to mention that. When we went into that prison camp, I had two things. That is, when we went into the cell, I had two things. I had acquired a tablecloth and a foot rule from a school. I just taken it, I must admit it. I thought that tablecloth might make that bed of mine a little softer. I don't know whether you know how hard wood can be. But I'm telling you, if you should sleep on this platform, as I did for 64 nights without anything under me, the old body can stand a lot, can it not? As I have often said rather jokingly, the first night you sleep on a hard bed like that, you don't sleep very much. The next night you sleep a little, and the next night you'll be so tired you'll sleep anywhere. And that's just about right. Well, I had a tablecloth and a foot rule. Well, they took the foot rule away from me, but they left me with the tablecloth. I'm thankful for that, and I'll tell you later why. Also, this doctor companion of mine, he had anemia, and he'd brought in certain medicines that he used to inject himself with. Maybe they may have been, I don't know just what it was. They took that away in the syringe, and they took a gold fountain pen, and they carefully made a record of everything they took. I don't know why they never gave them back. What's the use of taking a record? And this Walter Saul, they took all the things he had. But we had nothing, so they didn't take anything. They took pencils away too, but I had one hidden they never found. I didn't intentionally hide it, but it was in my back pocket, and that was quite handy later on. Well, there we were. This New Testament came in quite handy. There was a friendly Filipino who came and brought us our food. He was a prisoner also. And through this New Testament, Brother Lee and I communicated with each other. If you were to see it this means so much to me. In the back you would see text. The top says Pratt and the bottom, the other says Lee. And I would underline a text, put a little piece of paper in there, and it would be sent to him by this friendly Filipino, and he would keep it maybe for 4 or 5 or 6 hours between the two meals. And then it would come back to me, and then I would read what he had written to me. And you know, the Japanese never found it out. They really were quite dumb sometimes, I think. Yes, they were. They were clever, and yet they were dumb. Here is what he wrote to me one day. That is, here's what he wrote. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. That encouraged me. And then I'd find a text and send it back to him. And we did that for several weeks. I had $3 in money, but it didn't do me any good. You can't spend it. You couldn't spend it. And so that was that. This Walter Saul, after we left the prison, we were finally taken out of that place. The water situation became very serious, and they had to drink out of the drain. He contracted some bowel complaint and had 56 bowel movements in one day, and the Japanese left him to die, but he did recover. Dr. Cullen was in bad shape, and he spent a year in the hospital after he came out. Our food I've already told you about, and I need not mention that, I guess. When we were in this cell, we saw some strange sights. It seems the Japanese delighted to torture people in front of us. If anything will break down your morale, it is to see someone else suffer. The doctor, in watching this torture, maybe understanding, being a medical man, understanding a little better than I, he clasped his hands so tightly that when he opened them up, there were the prints of the nails in the palms of the hand. He was mad. He told me, and he was an ungodly man, and yet he had many nice ways. He said, "You may teach me to pray, but you can never take hatred out of my heart for the Japanese." And I guess he died that way. He died several years later. I want to tell you what I saw. I have no enemies, I hope, in this room. But I'm going to ask Brother Quinton to come up here. He's my friend, or he was before the service. And I'm not going to hurt him at all, but I want to show you what they did one day. And you can imagine how it must have hurt. They brought in a Filipino, and he was surrounded by several Japanese. Suddenly, one of them grabbed his arm like this, put his hand at his elbow, and his shoulder here. Now imagine, Brother Quinton, what it would feel if you had thrown it over that way. Threw him around to his head. And then he was dazed and bruised and broken, and another Japanese did the same thing. And they did it so many times that I said to myself, will they never stop? And then I began to count, and they threw that man 39 more times until he was a mass of broken bones and torn flesh. And they took the man away. And whether he lived or died, I do not know. I saw this many times. It tore your heartstrings to see it, thank you. That was what we saw. Another time they took a Filipino in the same way in the center, and they had clubs that were about as big as my wrist nearly. And they just beat that man on the head and on the back, on the shoulders, until he fell down, and they made him fainted finally, of course, and he was just a mass of pulp, and he was dragged away. This they did in front of our eyes, I suppose, trying to intimidate us. Yes, those were terrible days, hard days, and days that I would like to forget. One man they treated in that way. This was in the courtyard of this prison. One Japanese man, he seemed to be demon possessed. When that man was prostrate on the ground and he could no longer hardly move, he took his face, turned it to the gravel, and just rubbed it in the gravel with vindictiveness. Oh, it's a good thing that the doctor could not get hold of him, because it made him so mad. And it made me very much upset also. And the thing that kept me through all of those weeks and months was this little New Testament, God's Word. That is really a help to us. There's power in the Word, as we hope to say more about soon. Brother Lee and I were both taken out for questioning. It seems that they thought that we were in communication with the American. Where he had lived, there was an aerial that was as big as my little finger. And they must have thought that we had a sending apparatus. That's what we figured. You know, it's a good thing to be a Christian, because a Christian tells the truth. These other men, Dr. Cullen and Mr. Waltersall, they tried lying to the Japanese. And you know, you can't remember the lies you told 3 weeks ago. Now, nobody in this audience, of course, lies, but you know, there are people that tell lies. But if you tell the truth, you can always remember the truth. Isn't that true? And they never caught Brother Lee and myself in a lie, because we didn't tell anybody. I came very near, however, being caught, not in a lie, but it would appear to be, One day when I was being interviewed by a Japanese, he said, "Have you ever been in the American Army?" And I said, "Never." And the interpreter says, "He's not been in the American Army, he's been in the Navy." I said, "Never." But I caught it. And I said, no, that's not right. I have never been in the Army, and I've never been in the Navy. But had I not caught that, 3 or 4 weeks later they would have caught me, and they would have said, "Now, 3 weeks ago you said you were in the Navy, now you say you've never been in the Navy." And I'd have been caught in a lie which I had never told. That just illustrates, they were the greatest liars I ever saw. Isn't that right? Didn't they lie a lot? Remember that? But if they caught you in a lie, oh boy, you want to look out for that. Our stories always agreed. It's a good plan to tell the truth. This New Testament was a great comfort, and I have told you how I used it. I didn't eat that fish. I've been a vegetarian since 1911, and I expect to be until I die. I didn't eat the fish. Someone smuggled in some peanuts. They were boiled. And Mr. Lee gave me his share of the peanuts. Oh, there may have been 100 peanuts. I mean 100 peanuts. They were boiled. I don't like boiled peanuts myself. I like them roasted, don't you? Maybe you like them boiled. But I got some water. This was when water was a little more plentiful. And I put these peanuts in water. And then I would count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that was my diet for a day. 5 peanuts and a cupful of rice. And my, those peanuts tasted good. So I had those peanuts for about 20 days. I had a wonderful diet those 20 days. You try it sometime. Eat nothing but a cupful of rice, no salt, of course, and 5 peanuts. Nothing more. You can't really appreciate it, can you? But mine was good. Another time, after they got a little bit easy with us, this Walter Saul, a wonderful man, I always call him when we went back to the Philippines after the war. They had a piece of cheese. I think they still sell cheese in a package about that long and about that thick. It's a quarter pound, or what is it, an eighth of a pound? I don't know. And he'd taken one into the camp. And they'd been in the same cell together. And they'd eaten all but just about a mouthful. And one day I was out in what's the word I want to use there? Patio. I can't think of patio. Why don't you help me out with this? The patio. And he gave me that piece of cheese. It wasn't a good mouthful. But the other day I was over at the house and my wife didn't have the dinner ready. I got a piece of cheese. Why, I took 4 times that much. Thought nothing of it. I took that piece of cheese and I shaved it as thin as I could, and I used that for several days. Just a little bit on the top of my rice. The next time you eat a piece of cheese, take a piece that's not a mouthful and cut it up into 25 pieces, and then just eat one of those a day. And then you can appreciate what it means to be living under conditions that I'm trying to tell you. One day they forgot to bring us our breakfast. And when we called it to their attention, they said, "Well, we'll bring the next meal to you." What difference does it make? We weren't getting enough anyway to hardly keep us alive. But what did they care? Oh, I wish I could tell you more. I was finally transferred to cell number 2, later to cell number 1, and from that I finally got out. It wasn't a graduation process, but the Lord opened the way to get us out. Cell number 2 was backed up against the torture chamber. And sometimes for 4 and 6 hours a day we heard the screams of agony, the cries of pain of individuals who are being tortured. If anything can break your mind, that can. And the only thing that kept me was the Word of God, I believe. I saw some who lost their mind. But thank God I still can think fairly clearly. God has blessed me with a certain amount of physical strength, and I appreciate it. My good wife. I went into the torture chamber one day. It's an awful experience. There sat a petty Japanese officer behind a desk, and on the desk and on the walls were all sorts of torture instruments. Hooks, ropes, holes. And you did not know when you might not be tortured. That did something to you. But I am glad to testify that I was not tortured at all myself. There was in the prison there a cell which we called the death chamber. The reason why we called it the death chamber was because no one ever came out of it alive. Or if they did, they were taken out in shock. And so we called it the death chamber. Maybe I could show you how they tied up their prisoners before they shot them. This is something that very few people know about and very few have seen. But I learned how to tie the knot. I will tie it so nobody can see how I do it. It's a secret that I know. And then I'm going to take my friend Lester here. Now I have no hard feelings against him. I'm going to ask him to come up here, and I'm going to tie him up. And I'm going to tie him up in such a way that I don't believe he'd get away with him. Especially if I should really tie it. I won't tie him too tight. That's what you think. Put your hands up. Just hide it and go. All right, stand up straight. Don't be afraid. Now this goes around the neck. And then they tie this really tight. I'll not hurt him too much, because I still want him to call me friend. Then now, if he tries to get away, he just chokes himself. That's all. And then they would stick a bayonet into the man's back and take him off and shoot him. Saw that so many, many times. You want to leave it on, Lester? No, he doesn't want to leave it on. All right. That isn't so hot, is it? Kind of choking. Kind of choking, he said. All right. Well, all of those things added up to a trying experience, to say the least. While I was in there, we had I say we, my wife wasn't with me, we had a wedding anniversary. The 25th wedding anniversary. I don't know, but you kind of think of your wife on your wedding anniversary, and a man should remember his wife's anniversary. The man came to my house the other day with his wife. By the way, they were missionaries with us in the country of Siam. They came through. I think somebody here, I saw some of you folks, I think maybe there's a Carol in the car. You saw a car there. Did you see that? We went by a new 57 Mercury. Did you see that? I thought I saw Dale looking at it anyway. Did you see it, Dale? Yeah. I knew I saw you peeking out. See, Karen doesn't look at cars, but you do. And they came in and visited with us and went on to East Texas. They're from Texas. And she told us, this is our 42nd wedding anniversary. And he didn't even know it. What a man. And right there in the street, he kissed her. But he didn't even know it was their anniversary. Just like lots of other men. Do you remember your anniversaries? Your wife's birthday? If you don't, you better get on to yourself. Because nothing pleases the women more than to have such things remembered. And it doesn't cost very much. Remember next anniversary. You should do it. Well, our anniversary came, and I was thinking about my wife. I didn't know whether she was alive or whether she was dead. No communication came. But she thought that she would send me something. And all I know about it is that she's told me since. I never did see it. She sent some things over to the jail. You folks getting tired? I am. And some, what did you have, cookies? Cupcakes and what else? That's all, she said. Well, that was enough. And by one of our schoolboys, he brought them to the jail, and he tried to have them sent in to me. And they treated him very gruffly, and I never did see them. I suppose they enjoyed my wife's cupcakes. She's a good cook. You probably know that. You can tell by looking at me. And so they never came in. Well, the young man thought, I'll take some message back to Mrs. Pratt. And he said, how is Mr. Pratt? And the commandant told him. And he took the message back to my wife on our 25th wedding anniversary. He's probably dead by this time. What a message. What a cruel thing to do. But I wasn't dead. I was very much alive, although I was in a terrible condition. But that's what happened. They never allowed the things to come in. Well, lots of things happened. The clothes began to wear out. No soap, not sufficient water to wash things in. And you know, I wonder if you've ever been really filthy. We were just that. The clothes just wore out. If you want things to wear out, you just don't wash it. It'll just fall apart. Because you wouldn't know about that, but I'm telling you. And so I just had quite a problem. We didn't have to worry about being warm. We have, as I have told you before in the previous talk, just 3 seasons in the Philippines: the hot season, the hottest season, and the hottest season. We don't have any cold weather, real cold weather. And so that was no problem. And here's where the tablecloth came in. I conceived the idea of making, believe it or not, a pair of shorts. Now, I've never sewed in my life. I've watched my wife, and I still like to watch her sew, but I don't like to sew. She sews on my buttons most of the time. I guess all the time that they're sewed on. After a little urging, you know how it is. You men understand what I mean. I shouldn't say anything more. But I didn't know what to do. Here was a tablecloth. I didn't have a needle. But I did find a needle one day in the sand. And I was sewing away, and the eye broke. Why, that was worse than losing a $5 bill today. Really. But I found a good needle. I borrowed it. And I cut out something. And I began to wonder about thread. You know, I found some thread. I just raveled out the cloth. You know, that isn't very strong, but it made thread. And then I began to sew. I made some nice hems at the bottom of each trouser leg. And I made a big hem at the top. And then I thought, now I'll have a string to draw this thing together. And so I conceived the idea of making 2 good-sized buttonholes in the front. That was a problem. How to make a buttonhole. I remembered seeing my wife put the thread through and then throwing it over some way. And I began to experiment. And I finally found how you do it. I had plenty of time. Time was nothing to me. If I didn't get through this day, I got tomorrow, and if I didn't get through this week, I had another week. And so I made 2 nice buttonholes. Then I didn't have any strings. Well, I took a few pieces of cloth and cut them up and sewed them together, and then sewed them together, pieces about this long, and I finally had a string. And I put it in, and I put them on, and I was fully clothed. All I had. And I brought 1 pair of them here tonight, but I don't want anybody to come up and look at them, because they're terrible. But the color was the bad thing about them. They were the pinkest pink you ever saw. They faded out. And I'm not going to show these to anybody, but they're all worn out. But these, I actually made these myself. My wife put a patch on here. No, I'm not going to open them up. Well, I might open up partly. No, I'm not showing those. I'm putting those away. I don't want anybody to see those. But and then I made another pair. And the color of those, they were peach color. I changed them every day. Washing them now, I had water. I washed them in plain water, no soap. I had a peach pair today and a pink pair tomorrow. And that's all I wore. Nothing above the waist and nothing below the knee. Shoes began to give a problem. And one day I found a piece of wood just about the width of my foot. I borrowed a saw from the commandant or the man in charge. I sawed it off the size of the length of my foot. And then I rubbed it up against a concrete wall, and I kind of got it rounded so it looked a little bit better. I found some old rotten canvas and a few nails, rusty nails, and made myself a pair of wooden clogs. I wish I had brought them to the States. They were fearfully and wonderfully made, really. But I didn't. And so I was fully dressed with a pair of shorts and these wooden shoes. And that's the way we lived. All of us did the same thing. But some of them were not so fortunate as to have a tablecloth like I had had. Well, I could go on, I suppose, and tell you many other things, but I should not do that. I'm going to talk to the men folks, and I want you women to listen. Do you men folks ever complain about the food? Do you turn your nose up and say, oh, I don't want that? Ladies, I'm telling you now, you men don't even listen. Worry about those husbands. They'll not starve. If they're hungry, they'll eat most anything. I'm telling you truly. I was in a home not so long ago, and they burned the toast. And the man wouldn't eat it. Why, I said, you ought to thank God you've got toast that can be burned. When I tell you that 3 years I didn't taste a piece of white bread or any kind of bread. 3 years I didn't have a potato. Several years not an egg. Why, you know, I don't feel like complaining about anything. But some of us in this country do complain, I know. We learn to live simply, as you can realize from what I have said. Well, I suppose I ought to tell you that we learn to pray. Did you ever pray? Really pray in distress? We need to establish habits of prayer. And I can testify this evening, and I say this seriously, that although you may be behind prison bars, it cannot keep God out. I can testify that never did I enjoy a closer walk with God than those months I was behind prison bars. We learned to pray. One day, Mr. Lee and I had now been placed in the same cell with 2 other men. The doctor was in another cell, and we had a Mr. Redfern and a Mr. Walter Saul. And we were in one cell, and we tried to keep it clean. We had water. And they would clean it one day, and we'd clean it the next day. And one day we rather jokingly said it would be strange, it was our day to clean, that after cleaning this cell, as we were doing a good job, we should leave you. And that's exactly what we did. We had prayed. One day we had prayed, Lord, open the way for us to get out of this place. We have done nothing against the Japanese government, just happen to be Americans, which I'm thankful I am, and open the way that one of us may talk with a Japanese who will listen and then through him we may get out. And you know, within just a short time, the Lord fixed it so that I was called out, and a friendly Japanese interviewed me. I told him we were in there for no cause whatsoever, and that day we were taken out. We'd lost about 60 pounds in weight, and we hadn't had proper food to eat. We were taken to the regular prison camp, which now had grown to 100 people, the place where I said they had a wall 16 feet high. We couldn't look out, so we looked up. You know, it's a good thing to look up to God and to Jesus, isn't it? When we came into that camp, this good Baptist missionary nurse, oh, what a friend she is even today. One of the jolliest, one of the finest characters I've ever known. I'd go 500 miles to see that lady. I'm sure I would. Someday I hope she'll call on us. She said, "Are you hungry?" That was foolish question number I don't know what. Hungry? We were hollow to the tip of our toes. And so she went into the kitchen, and they had plenty of food then, and she fried for me, I'm a little ashamed to tell you, but I'm going to, 5 eggs. And I ate them so fast that they almost hit each other going down. And because I had not had any good food for so long a time, I got sick. Oh, awful sick. But you know, I found a blessing in that. To be sick because you had too much food was more fun than to be sick because you didn't have enough. So you can be thankful for anything. One night that I first got in that camp, oh, it was just like heaven. It was small and all that. I got up in the middle and I couldn't sleep. I got up in the middle of the night and I went outside. I get on my hands and knees and I patted the grass. And I said, thank God for green grass and flowers. I went up to a tree and I put my arms around that tree and I said, thank God for trees. I hadn't seen a tree for several months. I hadn't seen a spear of grass. You don't see too much in West Texas, do you, unless you look after it pretty good. But did you ever thank God for flowers and green grass, for trees, for friends and loved ones? Well, I never forget that. So we lived on there for a long time. Oh, I should tell you, 3 or 4 days after I got back there, my son and my wife came into the camp. I hadn't seen them. Well, I don't shed tears easily. I do have a tender heart, I believe. But I wept for joy. Not knowing whether they were alive or dead. Mrs. Lee and her 2 boys came in, and my wife and son. And I wept like a child. Oh, that was a happy day. To meet again my wife that I had kissed goodbye months before. Well, we stayed on in that camp until June 16th. It's our wedding anniversary. I could tell you many things about that camp, but I will not. And were taken to Iloilo, to Manila, through submarine-infested waters, and finally arrived in San Tomas, which was a large prison camp with about 5,000 prisoners of war of many nationalities. That seemed like heaven. You could buy most anything if you had money, and we always had money. You know, the Japanese would put you in jail if you had 1 peso, which is 50 cents of the old money. But we got ahead of them, you know, and they weren't so very smart. My wife had an iron bedstead in that camp, and we had some good pesos, so we rolled it up tight, had a little loop down in the string,
And then she'd put it up in that iron bedstead, one of those legs. When we wanted some money in the middle of the night, she'd lift that leg up a little bit and put a little hook up there and pull down the money and get a peso or two or three, and then throw it up, put it back in, and they never found it. Always lots of fun getting ahead of the Japanese in that way. And we did it for years, that's right. Well, we went on. We had a little fun too. They taught us how to bow. I don't know, did you learn how to bow? The Japanese? Come up here, let's try it. Come up here. Now, they taught us how to bow. And this is where we had to bow. Now let's bow. And you had to do it. And if you didn't do it, they might do something to you, isn't that right? They'll slap you, that's right. And they slap. They don't slap like that, but they slap with the whole hand. My, it hurts. So, it was a funny thing about the Japanese, though. If you bowed to them, they had to bow to you. And that was fun. If 25 Americans or other prisoners of war came along in a group and bowed to the Japanese soldier, why he'd bow. But we used to string out 25 of us in a line, and you have to bow 25 times. And sometimes we would tire them and they just turn around in disgust. That was fun, wasn't it? That was fun. That's right. Well, we have to do that. Mrs. Pratt lived in a room with 60 other women. It was called the Fighting 45th. Now, that was before she got there. I think it changed afterwards. Did you know women are worse than men under those conditions? No, I really mean it. I say it respectfully. Men get mad and fight and it's over with, but women just seem to harbor. I don't know why. And that was called the Fighting 45th. Yes, it was quite a thing there. We didn't live together for 3 years, but that's another story. Well, in Manila, we lived on, and then one Japanese commandant had said, he said, we can afford to be magnanimous as long as we are winning. Well, they weren't magnanimous to any great extent any time, but when the things turned against them, then they began to be tough. Really tough. First, they took all meat away from the camp. And then we, as Adventists, introduced peanut butter and peanuts. Now, you know, peanuts have a protein. They're not the best, maybe, but they do give you protein. And we could buy peanuts. We bought peanuts by the ton. I mean, the camp did. And we showed them how to make peanut butter. And the camp kept its health pretty well. And then after a while, they took the peanuts away, wouldn't allow us to have peanuts. They'd bring in tons of sweet potatoes. Maybe a third or half of them were rotten. And they expect us to eat them. They fed us with rice with weevils in it. We tried to get the weevils out, but I suppose I ate a good many hundred weevils too. Added to the protein content, you see. But it was terrible. We tried to pick them all out. Things got worse and worse as time passed. And I remember my wife going into a certain place where someone had thrown away their potato peelings. She scraped them up from the ground, cleaned them up as best she could, and made the most delicious soup I've ever tasted before. We were hungry. And when you're really hungry, you'll eat things. We cut down banana trees and ate the stalks of banana trees. Did you try that? You never tried that. Well, you've lost something, I'll tell you. Absolutely, there's no nourishment at all in banana trees, but it filled up the hollow place a little bit. And did you ever take a banana, throw away the banana proper and eat the skin? Try it sometime. We ate the banana skin. But we ate the banana too if we had it. We fried them and really they didn't taste so bad. You try one sometime. Just to realize what it's like to be under conditions such as I'm trying to describe. Things went from bad to worse, and they got tougher and tougher. There was one man in that camp. He had quite a bit of responsibility, and it seemed as though he endeavored to think of various ways to make it hard for the prisoners. And he certainly did. And he was finally shot by the American forces. Well, we lost weight rapidly. 1 week, I remember I dropped 10 pounds. It was terrible. We stood in food lines. And what did we receive at the last especially? I'm going to tell you. They had soup which they made from weevily rice and some corn. Or really they had a little porridge in the morning, about a cup and a half of porridge per person. At noon, they gave us this tin, this is the same size, full of soup. The soup that you can look right down through, you know what I mean, that kind that you could see the bottom of the tin. It was flavored, like the chicken soup we had about one time, said the chicken flew over, that was all. Well, that's about the way with that soup. There wasn't a thing in it, hardly, just a little colored. And that's all we had per day. 500 calories a day is exaggerating the amount of food that we received. I sat down to a meal not so long ago, and they had some nice thick soup. And I thought, why, that would make several gallons of what we had over there. Have you ever been thankful for a good meal that your wife prepares? Well, I hope you will be more thankful after this service than you have been before. During the time, I am not superstitious. On Friday, August 13 of 1943, I was operated on the outside for hernia, and I was operated on under local anesthetic. If you want to have some fun, you try that. I really went through quite an experience. Later on in the States, I had to be operated on again. But that's not, we don't need to say too much about that. 43 passed. 44 came, and things began to get tougher and tougher. There were rumors flying everywhere that the Americans were back. It was rumors. It was funny. There was a dog in there named Rumor. It was a funny thing. You'd say, Rumor, Rumor, and he'd come running to you. Well, you know, that's about the way rumors start and go, isn't it? Gossip is the same thing. Yeah, there were rumors of this and rumors of that. Then the pets began to disappear. The cats were eaten, the dogs were eaten, and snails and lizards and rats and mice all disappeared from the camp. They were eaten by the internees. They were hungry. I don't condemn them. I didn't eat them, but I don't blame them at all. I should tell you that when you're hungry, most anything tastes good. And then came September 21, 1944. I'll never forget the day. I can see just where I was standing. The sky was filled with planes. And we thought the Japanese were out there. We thought the Japanese were overhead, but we looked and bombs began to fall. And we knew it was American planes overhead. 200 of them. Oh, we thought, this was September 21, 1944. We thought deliverance was just around the corner. But it wasn't true at all. It was only the beginning. But we did know that Uncle Sam had not forgotten his people. Time went on. The planes came once in a while, but sometimes a long time between. And the Japanese made a rule that anybody who was caught looking up into the skies, looking at the American planes, would be punished, shot. But you know, you couldn't help looking. So we get out on the floor, the second floor of the building, and look up and watch those planes. Oh, they look good. Anything from America. We had been under the Japanese pancake flag for so many years. that we just loved to think that those boys were our boys, and that they were getting ready to rescue us from a living death. Sickness came. Our hands swelled. Our feet and legs swelled with beriberi, a malnutrition disease. Of the 4,000 or 5,000 people that were in the camp at that time, probably 75% had beriberi. And one of the questions we asked every morning was, how many died yesterday? Yes, people were dying every day. Some didn't make the grade, that's true. But thank God others did. They forbade us to watch the flames, as I have just said. Hungry all the time. Have you ever been truly hungry? I mean, have not had a square meal maybe for 6 months or a year? I doubt if you've ever been really hungry. I know, now I haven't had anything to eat since noon. We had such a splendid meal. And I don't feel hungry, I admit it. But I suppose some of you have eaten already tonight. And I suppose if you haven't eaten, you're going to eat. I'm going to eat a little something when I get home. I see someone will eat with me too. I'm glad they're here. But how about it? Why, you know, I used to dream of having a meal from soup to nuts. Oh, my. And I would dream, and my stomach just felt like laughing. You know how it is. I was so happy. And then wake up and find it was a dream. And then I opened my Bible one day, and oh, this Bible means so much more to me. I didn't mention it, but I read it through during the prison camp 3 years, 27 times. I just love God's Word. In the 29th chapter of the book of Isaiah, I read these words, and it shall be even as when an hungry man dreameth, and behold, he eateth, and he awaketh, and his soul is empty. Why, Isaiah thought about that before I did. And so I found the Word of God a wonderful book in every time of need. That's right. As things got worse and worse, one day the broadcaster, whose name was Clarence Belial, but he went under another name, he was a very important, very popular announcer on the middle radio station. And the Japanese were trying to find him, but they didn't know his real name. And he broadcasted for them in the prison camp for 3 years, and they never caught him. Strangest thing you ever saw. Right under their nose the whole time. Oh, he was marked for execution. And he broadcast one morning, we're very sorry to announce, unless more supplies of rice come in shortly, we'll have to cut the rations again. They've been cutting them. The next morning he announced the same thing. We're sorry to announce no supplies have come in, and if something doesn't happen, we'll have to cut again. Well, we'd already pulled our belts in until there was hardly any place to do it anymore. And then one morning he announced with a smile in his voice, you know what I mean? We have good news for you this morning. Supplies have come in. Better lately than never. You get the pronunciation of the word lately? We had heard rumors that lately had been taken by the Americans. The Japanese heard it better later than never, but we heard it better lately than never. And that told us that it had been confirmed, that the American forces were now on Leyte. They were on their way back. I read this in the Saturday Evening Post after the war. I heard it at that time, but I read it later. This very thing. Wasn't that wonderful? And the Japanese heard it wrong, and we heard it right. They gave us newspapers that they printed themselves, and we just didn't read them the way they wanted us to. For instance, they told one day about Guam being shelled by the Japanese, and we jumped up and down. We were so happy. Because Guam had been taken by the Japanese some months before, and now they were shelling it, they'd lost it, and we just read it that way. And when the Japanese found that we read between the lines, they didn't give us any more newspapers. They thought, oh, we can't fool those Americans, I guess. Well, that's the way it was. Sickness was everywhere. One of our men was very ill. He was nigh unto death. And I went to his bedside with this text, which I want to read to you now. And he said, he told me in Washington, D.C., not so long ago when I came through there, he said it gave him the courage he needed, and he's still alive. And I read this text to him and found the 118th Psalm. I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. The Lord hath chastened me sore, but he hath not given me over unto death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, and I will go into them, and I will praise the Lord. I took that to the bedside of a missionary of the Missionary Alliance Church, and he said it also gave him the courage he needed to fight on, and he survived and is still alive today. God's Word is a powerful agency for good and can help you if you will let it. It's terrible how we neglect the Word of God. I have formed a habit and follow it every day to spend time on my Bible before I spend time with my family. This morning I was up at 5:30 studying my Bible. So many of us sleep late in the morning and just get time to get to work. But we should make first things first. And the good word says in the words of Jesus, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. The Japanese were feeding us on 12.5 cents a day. We ate weeds, as I said, banana skins and other things. Oh, we had a wedding in the camp. I should tell you about that. And I was the minister who performed the wedding. I didn't have the clothes to wear, so I borrowed a suit from someone who had a suit. And even the bridegroom, he had to borrow a suit. But the bride had all the trimmings. She brought them in with her. She'd been planning to be married in 41, and she was married, I forget the date now. I didn't put that down, but it was 2 or 3 years later. And she wanted a wedding cake. And she tried to find some eggs, and she bought 2. And she paid for those 2 eggs $15 US. Do I hear anybody complaining about eggs for 60 or 70 cents a dozen? Buy a dozen at $7.50 a piece, and you might feel a little different. Isn't that right? I talked with a man in Singapore not so long ago, just before I left. I visited him on a boat. His name was Mr. Dean. He raised some tomatoes. He had a green thumb, I guess, and he sold 3 tomatoes for $50 US. Money doesn't count when you're in conditions like that. I remember this same Mr. Dean one day, a little girl, he was quite popular with the children, they all liked him. She called him, this little girl said, Mr. Dean, Mr. Dean. And he stopped, and I happened to be nearby, and she said, we have an egg at our house. Several children, several in the family. How about it tomorrow morning, Mrs. Trammell? You have quite a family? Because you have quite a family, you take 2 eggs, boil them, and divide them equally among all that live in your house. They wouldn't like it, would they? No. They might say something. But that's what that little girl, she was delighted that they had an egg. Well, we ought to be thankful for everything. They used to make a stand in line. They made a stand for counting. They'd count our noses every morning, every night. And we were getting weaker and weaker. So weak, in fact, my wife reminded me tonight, in the morning we'd go downstairs, we would take our bath towel down with us. For the place for a bath was on the lower floor, so we wouldn't have to go up and get the towel. You ever did that week? And then we'd take our bath and then we'd come up at night. Weaker and weaker. Losing our strength day by day. Very, very, as I've said. But thank God for that text, which was such a strength to us. As thy days, so shall thy strength be. We got thinner and thinner. We faced death. My wife tells me that she's sure I would not have lived a month longer. We never talked of death. We never talked of being discouraged. We tried to keep up our courage. We stopped having preaching service. We were having constant blackouts. Even in the daytime, they would not let us leave the room. except for emergencies. And at night, oh, the terrible things that happened. On Saturday, February 3, 1945, just like most any other Saturday, we spent most of the time resting. About 6 p.m. that night, 10 American planes flew over San Tomas, which, by the way, is the place one of the girls here tonight studied. That's right. 2 Filipino girls here on my left. One of them studied San Tomas. 10, what's the name? Both of them studied at San Tomas. Is that right? I'm sorry. And they flew down over that place. That was the signal we didn't know. That night I went to my room. I was in my room, and my wife tells the story from now on. 2 or 3 great, big, giant American tanks came right through the wall. They didn't come through the gate. And came into San Tomas. And they set themselves up in front of the building where my wife was staying. They had been told by the Japanese, do not look out the windows. Do not keep away from the windows. But they heard a language which they hadn't heard before. They could hear English being spoken, and they peeked out the window, and there was that great big American tank. A shout went up and down the stairs. Some of them went who could walk, and they put their arms around those soldier boys, and they said, you seem just like angels to us. And they were free. Oh, that was a wonderful experience. But I wasn't free. 60 Japanese rushed over to the building where I was, barricaded themselves, set the machine guns up, and held me and many others as hostages for 36 hours. My wife had food, and she was free, and my son too, but I did not. They finally negotiated with the Japanese and said, if you want to get us, you can, but we'll kill all the Americans we have here with us. I'm glad that the American forces didn't just come in and get them, but I would not be here tonight. They finally allowed them to go outside and rejoin the Japanese on the outside. And on Monday morning, February 5th of 1945, with the help of an American soldier, I went downstairs. And then went up the stairs to my wife's place, and she had an egg she had saved for me, some jam, some butter, and I think some bread. I cannot tell you how good it tasted after all those years without a decent meal. When you feel like complaining, brothers and sisters, men and women, children, think a little bit about the experience through which we went. And I only tell the story to honor God. But I want to go on and tell you a few other things.